Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the GTM News Show. I got Kris here today. Hey Kris.
Hey, what's going on? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. Thanks for joining me. The reason why I asked for you to come on and for some context for the audience was I've been following you on LinkedIn for a while. It's a general theme of a lot of my guests, and I appreciated a lot of your content you shared around webinars and particularly your outbound strategy around webinars. So we'll talk about a bunch of that today. You're also a great just marketing thought leader in general around
Oh,
SaaS
thank you.
acquisition and all that fun stuff. So definitely worth a follow um, for folks. But let's jump right into webinars, outbound strategy. Tell me, we'll start high level, explaining kind of your overall philosophy around webinars, and then how does your unique strategy help folks in this day and age in 2023?
Yeah, of course. So my approach to webinars may be a bit different than some of the traditional webinars. You'll see kind of a spectrum, right? On one side, you'll see the overly salesy info marketer type of webinar where it's like, hey, do you want to change your life? Say yes in the chat and all that very corny stuff. That they're selling some $5,000 Amazon FBA course, right? And then on the other side, you might have very boring corporate webinars where people are droning on and on, and then there's no call to action. You're like, what are we doing? So I like to be in the middle of those two extremes. And really, I mean, I guess as far as a philosophy, it's really just front loading with helpful content that the audience cares about,
Mm.
which I know sounds groundbreaking, right? It's like, who knew? But no, really, like just what does this audience find helpful? And I specialize in SaaS, so I work with B2B SaaS companies. And so my goal is always when I'm looking at the audience, what pain points do they have? What desired transformations do they have? Help them achieve that, and just giving them best practices, things they should know, and then finding out how the SaaS can fit in that transformation. Because that's another mistake I see is where people will say, "Oh, we're going to do a webinar," and it's just a demo. Like
Mm.
literally, no one wants to watch your demo. I'm not signing up to watch you drone on and on and click unless I'm ready to buy. So making the demo part of it very short and just showing very easily, like, "Hey, remember how we talked about X, Y, and Z? Well, here's how we do it," and letting the software sell itself, and then driving that next step, that micro commitment, whatever that may be. For some clients, it might be a free trial. It could be a sales call, it could demo. Sometimes it could even just be purchasing directly, depending on the price point. So that's kind of the webinars in a nutshell. And you also mentioned that the outbound strategy.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So, and this was something I did on accident. Like when I started on webinars, I was doing sales at a SaaS company and we were doing outbound calling, like literally cold calling all day. And we would do some outbound email, but nothing really came of it. So I begged the founders, like, hey, can I try something? I was losing my voice doing sales calls. Can I try doing a webinar? And it worked really well. And at the time, I didn't know anything about paid traffic or nurturing or anything. So I was like, well, I know we have this cold email thing. I'll just email these people and see if they want to come to the webinar. So that's all I knew. And then later people were like, so how much are you paying for traffic? I'm like, paying for traffic? What do you mean? So that was my first couple of years. So that's kind of something I stuck with. And obviously later on learned about paid traffic. But really, it's essentially when you think about outbound, what do we see is okay, SDRs are doing this or an agency or whomever. We're sending emails out. Hopefully, you're sending a sequence, right? Instead of just sending one blast. But let's say you do a 5-touch email sequence. And what do? Oh, can we have a demo? Do you have a time to talk? Hey,
Mm.
can we talk? Can you book a time on my calendar? It's like, well,
Mm.
no. So giving them some softer calls to action, whether it's like, hey, would you like me to send some more info? Or hey, by the way, here's a webinar that's either upcoming or even one that we just did. Thought you might just want to check it out. And then you put the ball in their court, let them consume the content. And I see this all the time, even for myself, where like, who the hell is this? Like someone booked a call on my calendar and like, oh yeah, they got the sequence, they saw a video, and then decided to come in. So it's really just trying to make a cohesive strategy, whether it's with webinars, with outbound, with email nurturing, with content like case studies and white papers, is creating a cohesive customer journey. Because that's
Mm.
another thing I'm big on is having things tie together. I see this all the time where I'll actually just had this conversation earlier this morning where the client's like, yeah, so marketing, they send out these emails for new prospects, but then also sales sends out emails at the same time. And I went, do you guys talk to each other at all? No. Okay, that's great. 'Cause literally, you know what I mean? Like there's literally no alignment at all.
Mm.
And so having something cohesive between marketing and sales
Mm.
is such a win because it's a very common problem. I've seen this for years where I've been on this. I mean, I've been on both sides of this, being in sales where someone's like, "Hey, here's your marketing collateral," and you're like, what is this? Like, here's a folder, here's something. Like, my first sales job, I was selling advertising over the phone, like selling yellow pages and early online listings for Verizon, and all of our collateral was folders. I'm like, well, I'm selling over the phone. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this folder. Do I mail it to them? Like, just things like that. Like, it was like you're creating things in a vacuum. And then on the sales side too, being on the marketing side, where someone's like, hey, we have these leads coming in, and they're like, oh yeah, I didn't follow up with them, or I didn't call them. Like, so it's definitely a two-way street. So my goal is always to bridge the gap between marketing and sales, because that's really where the magic happens, right? Like, everyone's got their view of like, what marketing should be. My definition is very simple. Marketing's job is to help create pipeline for the sales team. Obviously, for a sales-led organization, if it's something where it's like it's direct purchase, then it's like, oh, we'll help create pipeline for purchasing. Everything else, the branding and clicks and open rates, that's all in service of pipeline. Like if someone's like bragging about their click rate, like, what's your money rate, dude? Like, where's the money? I don't care about, So yeah, I've got some hot takes.
Yeah, I love it.
Hot takes all day.
I love it. Super cool. Thanks so much. That's a lot. And I will, let's I'm going to go back a little bit, and we're kind of I made a list and kind of going through, because there's a bunch of things that I think folks should consider. First, let's talk about front loading with valuable content. And everyone is, being bored or being pitched to death in a webinar. I hear people's objections. Number one, you don't want to give away too much content or too much value without you don't want to give away the secret sauce of how everything's made before they get on a call with you or whatever. Tell me about what you've experienced with like giving as much content, as much value as quickly as possible, unconditionally.
Yeah, I always think it's funny when people are like, you got to hide this sauce. I'm like, there's nothing to hide, number one. and number two is like, people forget that they are fighting for attention, right? Right now in this podcast, if someone's listening to it or clip, we're fighting for attention. So when you go into a webinar and you go, hey, we're going to talk for 10 minutes. I went to the University of and I majored in like, who gives a shit, right? Like, I'm here for a reason, and especially B2B type of content. I'm not here because you're so interesting. I'm not here because I love the sound of your voice. I'm not here because you're a movie star. I'm here because I want to learn something that will help my business. I was actually on a webinar yesterday, just watching, because I was like, oh, this is interesting. And someone in the chat, actually, I think I might have posted on LinkedIn. Someone in the chat went, bro, you've been talking for 10 minutes and haven't said a thing. Please get to the point. And that is such a critical error, right? People, and I see this sometimes, it's because people think like the act of doing a webinar is sufficient. It's like, no, that's just the beginning. That's the vehicle. So when you talk about content, number one, keep those intros short. Like when I do mine, I just go, yeah, blah, blah, blah. I've worked with so-and-so. Who cares? Like, I could make a joke out of it. Like, hey, here's people I worked with. You can Google me. Who cares? And just give a few bona fides of like that I know what I'm talking about. Like, hey, okay, we've done 7 million in attributable revenue, worked with X amount of clients. I'll show the logos. Now let's get to it. And then same thing for a company can do this, right? Hey, we've worked with Disney and IBM and blah, blah, blah. And we've helped X number of people do whatever. Then get to why they're there. And so with the idea of front loading is, again, like this is sometimes where people mess up in two ways. One is the topics themselves no one cares about, right? They're like, oh, why didn't anyone want to hear about my webinar about creating value in a marketplace? Like, what does that mean? What are you talking about? Right? So like the hook of the webinar is so important. And then once you've got a good hook, just give them the info. So like the way I structure it is like, so let's say I have a high level thing I want them to achieve, right? Like, hey, I want you to double the conversion rate on your demos, for example, right? Now I'll start giving best practices and mistakes. Like, hey, these are the top 3 mistakes people make on demos. And I'll start going through that stuff. And the first few things may have nothing to do with the software at all, but I know the audience cares about this, right? So like, I've done a lot of webinars for insurance or AI or developers. it doesn't matter who it is, people want to get better at what they do. And so if you're giving them these best practices going, oh, that's interesting. And things that you sometimes, especially with brands, they think some things are very old hat. They're like, oh, people won't care about that. It's like I did one for trade show marketers, right? And the client was like, man, we need to have this very esoteric and weird content. And I'm looking at the stuff and I went, you know what? I bet let's just try this. And we gave them some tips that like the client was like, oh, we know that, but the audience had no idea. They're like, we have to follow up with our leads. I had no idea. Like if I follow up with my leads faster, I make more money. It's like, it can be that simple, right? It's like best practice is a best practice. And so educating them with these best practices showing this transformation, right? Storytelling, case studies, showing the magic, right? Because people don't care about your product. They care about what your product does for them. And so that's the other thing too, is I get very product heavy with webinars where they're like, hey, and this is how this product does X, Y, and Z. That's only if you've got a really cool product. Like the exception to this rule is like Descript. I love, they have very product heavy webinars, but their product is amazing. It's so cool. Just going like, wow, you can edit a podcast and you can do this and do this. But most of the time for products, like the product itself, no one cares about. But if I show you, hey, this is how you save 10 hours a week, or this is how you can automate your follow-ups. This is how you can generate referrals, on autopilot, right? These types of things. And then as you show these best practices, again, like you're fighting for attention. So they're there. And now you've got credibility, right? Robert Cialdini talks about this in Influence, this reciprocity principle, right? Where if I give you something, right? I'm going to give you this great content. Now you're giving me your attention. So when it's time for the ask, when it's time for like, hey, by the way, if you want a free trial, they go, oh, well, this person has credibility. I'm already excited. As opposed to, I'm going to bore you to tears and then be shocked that you don't want to buy from me, right? Wow, I've bored you for an hour. What do you mean you don't want to buy my SaaS that I didn't show you? That's another one I can't. It's hilarious to me where I'm like, they'll show screenshots of it. I'm like, you will never in your life have 300 people in real time live that can look at your product and you're not going to show them anything, not a thing. Give them a minute, give them a few minutes of it just to show how easy it is. Yeah, I could rattle on.
I love it. Super good stuff. Oh man, I think a couple things that stood out. Obviously, fighting for attention. I think marketers and sellers maybe are so close to this that we probably are a little more aware of this. But folks that are outside those functions, I think the average person. I think Forbes came out with a study. The average person has like 5,000 ads in front of them a day. Which is just crazy, right, to think about. And then in general, just because somebody's consuming your content doesn't mean you have to keep them engaged, and the pacing and the value is like, just look at like TikTok, right? Like our attention spans are only getting shorter. And that's why platforms like TikTok are so popular. I think the same type of mindset we have to take over into especially the B2B and long form content where your value per second has to like skyrocket, right? Super interesting. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how do you pick the right hook or pick the right titles. I know through my experience, like it took me, when I first started doing webinars, very similar story actually of how I got into webinars. I was a salesperson and somebody told me, hey, you should do some sort of live event or webinar in your funnel. And it was groundbreaking and have never turned back. It's been a pretty awesome experience. Creating long form content in that way. But I'd love to hear from you because it took me a while to figure out the topics and the hooks and the titles and the content that people would resonate with. What's your process? How do you go through that without doing, like for me, it took me like 12 webinars 6 months later. That I was like, oh, here's the one that's like, that got viral and, 400 registers, later and, 3 or 4 new clients out of this one web. It was awesome, right? How do you expedite that? How do you get that faster process?
Yeah, so it's funny because you mentioned the point about TikTok, right? About like, hey, we're fighting for attention spans are short. But somebody can go on TikTok and they might be on it for an hour, right? They're watching all these videos. So like you're keeping that attention. And the hooks, kind of like TikTok in a way, it's what people are already searching for. So I do a lot of customer research. So with every client, we do a ridiculous amount of research. So like We will scour every review of their product, their competitor's product, look for commonalities, look at message boards and Facebook groups and wherever this target audience is. What are they complaining about? What are they talking about? What's the way that they speak, right? Because like every industry has their own little jargon, things like that. I listen to sales calls religiously. And same problem with webinars, same thing with demos. People are so goddamn boring on demos where it's like, hey man, I signed up for a sales call, but like I'm getting paid to listen to it and I'm still bored to tears sometimes listening to demos. But listening to that, and I also love doing customer interviews. If clients have them, I'll just listen to the recording, but I love interviewing customers because it's one of those funny things where people go, yeah, we talk to our customers. And I go, did you talk to a customer or did you talk to a prospect? Right? Because after they sign up, when's the last time you spoke to them? When's the last time anyone spoke to them? And just like checking in like, hey, so, Kevin Dorsey, who's on LinkedIn, has a great, I think it's like 4 or 5 question thing. So I'll abbreviate it, but basically asking like, hey, why did you buy? What problem were you trying to solve? What's your favorite feature? What kind of time savings or, whatever benefits did you reach? And one of my favorite questions too is like, what did you do 5 minutes before you started using the app? What were you doing? And then just kind of understanding their workflow. And like, again, like I love getting this information because the best copywriting hack is just to speak in the language that your customers already use and give their words back to them. And it happens all the time on a webinar where someone's like, did you sell insurance before? Or, wow, are you an ETL developer? I'm like, nope, I don't know anything about this. I just listen to you guys and it's, but like you just speak those little bits of jargon, right? Like you mentioned some type of CRM they use or some type of process and they go, oh, that's for me. And it's counterintuitive, but I'm a big believer of this in marketing and specifically webinars of getting narrower, right? If someone says like, hey, I'm doing something for sales teams, like, okay, that's great. But can we narrow it to like an SDR at a B2B SaaS that does enterprise deals? Right. And it's like the same type of information, but the more specific you can get, the more your audience will go, oh, that's me. That's all you want. Like Chris Voss has another thing in that book, Never Split the Difference, where he goes, the things he wants to hear, he doesn't want to hear yes from someone. He wants to hear that's right. Like he was like a hostage negotiator. And so he wanted to be able to speak that person's thoughts back to them and the person go, that's right. So if you can get to that, that's right, you're on the right track. And my litmus test for any webinar is I'm going to invite customers to it because I know if customers want to show up, then it's good. Because if customers are like, I don't know, it sounds sketchy, like then I know it's like, oh, there's a problem. And it also keeps you honest as a marketer because you're like, oh, maybe I'll offer a discount because they're on the webinar. It's like, better not offer that discount because that becomes your new price. So now the customers are on there like, oh, by the way, if you're, like it keeps you from doing the dirty tricks, right? Of like the short-sighted things. And that's, again, that customer journey, because another thing people are like, why do I want to invite customers to the webinar? And I go, dummy, you have people in the chat that love your product and they're going to type in, man, I love this CRM. You can't buy that kind of social proof. You can't buy that of people in the chat that don't work for you singing the praises about your product or go, man, I love the call recording feature. It's like, great. And one of my favorite style of webinars to do is interview a customer. That was how I started because again, like I didn't know anything about webinars, but like I was selling to insurance agents back then. And I went, oh, I think so-and-so is like the number one guy at Farmers Insurance. I wonder what he does. And so, so I called him up. It's like, hey man, would you want to do a webinar and talk about your process? And I just interviewed him like this. And I went, hey, so like, how did you get started? What do you do on your sales calls? What kind of leads do you buy? Do you use a script? Oh, by the way, how do you use the software? Do you use the dialing functionality? Do you send text messages? Do you do this? And and then your customer demos the product for you. Because like I can demo it and go, well, here's the reporting tab but like I'm not the end user, but it's so much cooler when they go, oh yeah, I use this, I don't use this that much. And it can be scary because you're like, oh shit, we're demoing in real time, but it's so fun, and the audience always loves it. So it's like it's less work and it's also more fun. So like you combination of like doing intense research and then being able to structure the webinar in a way with a freeform interview is the most fun. That's what I feel like. That's kind of like, if there's one thing I do better than anything else in this, is probably that.
Gold, Kris. Oh, I love that. I mean, I think for anyone that is looking to, like you said, back on the copywriting hack, just take your customers' words, right? And doing customer research and just, not only putting yourselves in their shoes, right? Being super empathetic and trying to get yourselves, because that's the one problem of every marketer, every seller, is that we're usually not the buyer, right? We've usually not been in their shoes. And so it's really hard ultimately to bridge that gap. And so all that customer research is gold. And then I love that little, you just threw that in there almost casually, was you brought your customers on and invited them on, which validated a couple things. First, it validated the content is valuable enough for them to take time out of their day, number one, which is huge, that you get that validation. But then you also have all that social proof, and you're getting them now to engage in the webinars. And then you also took it one step further, where you had them coming on and actually speaking, and also also contributing to the content. I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit about that, because I know for me, starting out was like super overwhelming to get up on stage. Like I remember my first webinar was like, I was like sweating bullets. I like had to do an hour of meditation beforehand. I'm being hyperbolic, but it was like, super nerve wracking. And so I know a lot of folks experience that, right? Stage fright ultimately. But what I heard was you actually brought somebody else on the webinar to help create the content. Tell me about different formats of webinars that you can do. That's not just thought leadership from the company, you or somebody else on the team, but somebody outside, whether it's a customer or other thought leaders.
Yeah, for sure. So, kind of the traditional webinar, right? The way I structure it, I call it the high impact training, but it's essentially thought leadership, right? It's you by yourself. Maybe you have a few people from your team, like sometimes, hey, maybe you have somebody in product or somebody in sales or somebody in development to speak about different aspects of the product, but it's all internal. And I think that's a good go-to, especially like when you're doing your first one, just so you're not trying to reach out to too many people and make it too complicated. But there are other ways to do it too. Like I call that one, the other one, the customer win, right? Where it's like, if you have a customer that kills it in some area of their business. And again, this is the power of talking to your customers and knowing them is, you like, I always like, anytime I get a new client, it's like, hey, I'm going to talk to the sales team. I'm going to talk to customer success. Hey, who are your favorite customers? Who's doing really well? Somebody that gives a case study, whatever. And understanding that and saying, oh, this person was a top seller on Amazon, right? And the thing is, there's a couple fun things. Number one is people love talking about themselves, right? So go, hey, I'd love to interview our power users and just like, what you've been killing it in this area. I'd love, there's other people, other types of businesses that probably would love to learn that too, right? And then the second thing is, obviously you get that social proof. Because the thing is, if you think about all B2B content at the end of the day, people just want to get better with their business, right? It's like, how do I make more money? How do I save time? How do I take myself out of the day-to-day operations? How do I automate things? How do I blah, blah, blah? And it's all just under the umbrella of better. So if you have your target audience and they go, yeah, this person's killing it, right? And what they're teaching you may be very tangential to your product, right? It could be, but it's like, it's for that market, and you can just show it in some way that's so much more valuable than some generic stuff that you're just going to, that you can find anywhere, right? And it's not to say there's not a place for that, but I think the more you can get to firsthand accounts, and especially not just even customer firsthand accounts, but your firsthand accounts as the SaaS or the product, because you deal with this market all the time, right? So if I go, hey, I've interviewed, or we've worked with 10,000 B2B sales reps and analyzed their calls. This is what we found, right? This is what we've seen with all of our blank, our concert promoters, or whatever market it is. Because you know more of that market than any one of them do, right? It's like let's say, I don't know, you're a Domino's franchisee, right? You might know a couple, but I know 500 of them because that's who I sell to. I sell to Domino's, right? I sell the Domino's super duper pizza app, I'm just making this up,
Yeah.
but like, you know what I mean? But I talk to them all day. So I'm like, hey, this is what, so I like, that's what I'll do too, is like, when I'm repurposing content, as I get a theme, right? It's like, maybe I've done like 5 or 6 of these customer win type of webinars. I might turn around and go, hey, these are the secrets of the top trade show marketers, right? Because I've interviewed them all and I collect that stuff. And that could be a webinar, that could be a white paper, that can be a case study, and it's all firsthand. And it's and the fun part too is you can talk to your customer success team, you can talk to your sales team, right? Because like they're in the trenches. And like I think that again, when we talk about alignment, it's not just marketing and sales, it's everything. Everyone should be aligned on this, on our goal, on this growth. And it's cool too, because like other departments get to hop in and go like, hey, this is what we do when we onboard people, this is what we've seen works. I think marketing, like when marketing silos and they're like, oh, we're just, don't bother us. It's like, it's a mistake.
Yeah.
You should be with everybody.
Completely agreed. Yeah. And especially from a content development strategy standpoint, marketing sometimes is, for better or worse, the furthest away from the product and the customer, right? Like customer success, the product team, sales, they are even closer sometimes to, in the trenches, actually working with the customers more. And so leveraging that is super important. We could probably talk about another half an hour of how to get your team all on the same page. But I kind of want to shift gears for the next 5 minutes we have left here, is talking about that outbound strategy of going back to the beginning of our conversation of how you just tell me about the pitfalls maybe people should avoid when they're going out cold. If I understand correctly, you go out cold to folks that are prospects, right? And invite them to an engaging webinar. Tell me about the pitfalls with that people should avoid.
Yeah, probably the big pitfalls would be being overly salesy, keeping it casual. Hey, I thought you might be interested in this, blah, blah, blah. Not enough personalization, not enough relevance. So like, when you think about outbound, there's 2 big channels. There's cold email and LinkedIn. You could do other stuff. You could do DMs or something if you're on other platforms. But for what I do, it's cold email and LinkedIn's the primary part. Sending irrelevant content, like, hey, it's not for them, like you're not researching your target market enough, you're not making it personalized at all. The content itself is boring. It's like, hey, I thought you'd be interested in this shitty thing that you're not going to care about. Oh, you're not. So those are probably the big ones. And also not doing it frequently enough, right? I think the thing with webinars is if you can do a new live webinar every month, you're going to get that snowball effect, right? Because at the end of the day, what you want is to build that warm list of people that know you and have engaged with you, because now you can email them, you can retarget them with ads, you can have in-app messages, free trials, whatever. And the more you do it, the more powerful it gets. Like, let's say I start with an email list of 100 people. Hey, I did a webinar and 200 new people signed up from cold email or LinkedIn. Okay, well, now I've got 300 people. So I can email them and do some new people. Now I've got 500. Now I've got 1,000. Now I've got 2,000. It just builds on itself, right? The webinar itself is a channel. And I know that sounds strange. Like, what do you mean? It's like, well, because like if you cold email someone and they don't respond or don't do anything, well, they're dead. But if I cold email them or LinkedIn them or whatever, SEO, where they opt into the webinar, they've taken a nice commitment and they've become, they've gotten into that warm email list, that MQL or whatever you want to call it. And now you can build that relationship. But if you're doing webinars once a year, you're not going to get as many at bats and they're not going to remember you. So recommend doing it, if you can, once a month is great.
Super cool. I completely agree. I remember when I first started doing them, it wasn't until like the 3rd or 4th webinar I did where we started getting, customers out of it and getting new clients, where it was like, hey, I watched 2 or 3 of your webinars, right? And I remember that phrase, like multiple clients, like I've watched 2 or 3, and it took a little while to build that relationship, right? Especially in B2B world. And if you're an enterprise, we all know sales cycles only get longer, and it takes a while, right? To build that relationship. So it takes a while to build that trust. And it may take 2 or 3 events. It's not just going to be like one event and you're going to convert everyone. It's a great advice in general for marketing. Anything else before we wrap up here? Any other kind of things we haven't mentioned, or any other pitfalls in general that folks should avoid when doing webinars and in this particular strategy?
One thing I don't see enough of, and people are getting better at it, but is repurposing the content, right? They do a great webinar. They spend all this time on it. They put it out there and then that's it, right? But so for me, like that, the webinar is the beginning. So after the webinar is done, repurpose it to an evergreen presentation. Take clips out on social media, put that there, turn it into a blog. My first webinar I did, that interview with that guy, I turned that into an ebook. Again, because I was like, I bet people would be interested in this. Transcribed it, sent it to a designer. And I literally didn't know what I was doing. I'm like, I bet people would like this. Did that with a cold email. We got 300 leads. Like people opting into the marketing in like a day. Because people are like, oh, I want to download that ebook. Because it wasn't just a generic ebook. It was like, oh, the secrets of the number one, blah, blah, blah. And again, webinar was already done. But it's like, same content, different format. You can now 10x your reach with that approach.
So cool, Kris. Well, I want to congratulate you on your curiosity. I think is so cool, and just actually something for everyone to consider as they're thinking about doing any sort of initiative like this is just try stuff, and you'll be so surprised at first, obviously putting yourselves in the other people's in your audience's shoes and being super empathetic and selfless, but also curiosity, and that's super cool. Super awesome. Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge, and I'll have to have you on again. I'm sure we could do a part 2 at some point. How can folks follow you, connect with you online?
Yeah, you can. I'm on LinkedIn, so Kris Sharma. If you put me in there, my company's called Webinar Grow. It's like it sounds. You go to webinargrow.com. Those are probably the 2 big places. I think I have a YouTube channel for Webinar Grow, but I don't. I'll make some videos.
We'll hold you to that. Well, I'll send you the original of this podcast, and you can repurpose it for your YouTube channel.
Yes.
Super cool, Kris.
Awesome, man.
Thanks so much for coming on.
Much.
Yeah.
Appreciate
I'll talk to you soon. Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.